I wrote a little reflection about some of the beliefs that I have based on my faith, and I'm just going to read it out. I like to say interfaith runs in my blood. My father is a Hindu and my mother is a Jain. So I, the child of two faiths, had to find my own way and reconcile the seeming differences and contradictions between my two faiths. Many years of thinking and asking questions have made me not just Jain, not just Hindu, but a self-proclaimed Jindu. Growing up in the Jain temple, I consider myself blessed to have such amazing teachers. My teachers taught me that being Jain has little to do with being born into a Jain family. Rather, it has everything to do with following the values which the Jinas, the conquerors of the inner self, passed along to spiritual seekers. From this point onwards, I started to see that anyone that followed this value of non-violence was like me. Non-violence, you see, was the main value taught by the Jinas, and thus it became the main value of the Jains. The value of non-violence is extremely powerful, and so I want to explain a little bit about what Jainism's take is on non-violence. Jainism defines non-violence as the opposite of violence. So, what is violence? Well, according to Jain scripture, violence is considered something that takes away any of the 10 following life forces. If it harms any of the 5 senses, touch, taste, smell, sight, or hearing, the mind, body, or speech, the lifespan, or respiration, then it's considered violence. I love this definition because it goes so far beyond what we normally conceive of as violence. It's so broad that it even encompasses the nature and environment around us. If we followed nonviolence to the degree that we tried to reduce the violence we cause to any living creature, we would certainly solve many, if not all, of the great world problems today. My search to understand nonviolence began with compassion, along with compassion, was what led me to interfaith work and collaboration. But perhaps this makes sense, since interfaith work and nonviolence are deeply connected. In interfaith dialogue, we look beyond the seeming differences of one another to see how we are similar. Understanding is the essence of interfaith work. With nonviolence, we seek to reduce the harm we do to living beings by understanding that no living being wants harm. We seek to change our behavior and act with more awareness in the world. Therefore, understanding is also the essence of nonviolence. So perhaps by practicing nonviolence, I strengthen my resolve for interfaith work, and by practicing interfaith work, I broadened the range of my nonviolent action. I'd like to end with a simple story about my uncle, Hemang, who's a living example of nonviolence and understanding in my life. Just by watching him, you can see that he truly practices what he has learned. To get the idea of his response, you have to think of an example of a time that you would complain to someone about something. Pick your choicest complaining moment. I like to call it the complaining pants moment. So for me, one of my complaining pants moments is I often complain to my uncle about how seemingly lazy so much of the world or our surrounding is, and how difficult it seems for other people to do service for one another. Given that my uncle is deeply invested in service and nonviolence, my uncle's response was a little bit surprising. He simply says, "Oh, Hemang, you know, people are so busy. They have so many important things to do." And so at first I thought this was just complacency. I didn't really accept that. But then I realized his answer wasn't from complacency or for just trying to give them a pass. His answer was truly from the desire to understand, from their perspective, what they were doing. So, how often do we give people humanity in those moments of complaining and realize that they may have a reason for behaving the way that they do? So now, even though I have my fair share of complaining past moments, I try to be a little bit more understanding, just like interfaith values have taught me, and also my life as a Jindu has taught me. So, thanks.
And next up we have Ed Clint, and he is a senior here at U of I. He studies psychology, and he's been involved in interfaith work, and as well as work with the Secular Student Alliance here. So please join me in welcoming Ed Clint.
Hey everybody. I hope you're all suitably exhausted as I am from all that hard work, which ironically did not result in a building up an appetite at all. And I also hope that you've enjoyed, as I have at this conference, hearing from so many different voices. We've heard reflections from a Muslim, pagan, Calvinist, and even something called a Christian, which I thought was a little bit out there. And they do grow on you after a while. I don't know if we have yet, but I'm an atheist and have been for a long time, since I was about 13, and I'd be willing to wager one or two of you wonders what inspires an atheist who's involved in interfaith. Is it the fun of confusing hardline theists? Well, that's more of a perk. I think inspiration is the same for me as it is for all of you. Inspiration happens when something beautiful in the world grabs our attention and won't let go. Maybe it's a beautiful idea, moral act, human impulse, a song, a clever joke. But aesthetic splendor or trenchant meaning is not enough. It is sufficient for mere admiration. But inspiration takes more. We must see something in the world we do not possess or have not produced that we might possess or that we may produce, at least in our own estimation. And that includes versions of ourselves that may come. Understood this way, inspiration requires no reaching for ineffable residents of the heavens. It requires only having your eyes open and paying attention to the people who are around you. The supporting cast in your own biography. For me, and although he is long departed, one of those people is named Henry Louis Mencken. Mencken was an author and a journalist born in the late 19th century, and he did most of his writing and reporting through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. He's sometimes called the greatest journalist in US history, and I would assent to that. He was a relentless critic of nearly everything, and now you're starting to understand his appeal to me in particular. He had a barbed tongue and penetrating insight, and a smooth eloquence that was equally the match of a Mark Twain, although he's not nearly as well known. Everything is a grist for Mencken's very quotable mill. For example, he said, "It is now quite lawful," and this would have been in the 30s or 40s, "It is now quite lawful for a Catholic woman to avoid pregnancy by a resort to mathematics, though she is still forbidden to resort to physics or chemistry. The penalty for laughing in a courtroom is 6 months in jail. If it were not for this penalty, the jury would never hear the evidence. And maybe most apropos, we must respect the other fellow's religion, but only in the sense and to the extent that we respect his theory that his wife is beautiful and his children smart." Now, Mencken diligently punctured government, religion, higher education, artists, ordinary people, everybody. He was prolific. And if you read only his extensive lists of pithy quotes that are now amassed on wonderful little sites on the internet that dedicate themselves to such pursuits, you might expect that Mencken is a churlish cynic, and that his mind is maybe a dark and bitter place. For example, in the play and the movie called Inherit the Wind, which is based on actual events, and in part on Mencken, the fictionalized Mencken who is in that play called Hornbeck steadfastly mocks both sides of the plot's conflict throughout, and eventually a protagonist exclaims in fury, "You have no meaning. You're like a ghost pointing an empty sleeve and smirking at everything that people feel or want or struggle for. I pity you." And that's a fictional line, but I think that is really what people thought about Mencken in his time, and maybe now if you just read through his quotes. But I have a few of his books, and I know him a little bit better than that, and all this really fails utterly to understand what the man was like. Through all of his scathing editorials, Mencken never sets him apart from the rabble. He sees humanity as a circus, but his own life is part of the menagerie. For example, he once said, "All men are frauds. The only difference is that some admit it. I myself deny it." He made criticisms, but he nonetheless embraced and genuinely loved mankind. I know this in part because the last 4 decades of his life, he lived in the same place and he had the same job. He was a successful man. If he wanted to leave and go anywhere, he could have, and he didn't. He stayed right where he was. But I also know this from his writing, and I want to read you a brief passage. In his book on religion, Mencken was writing about the afterlife, and about it, he said, "Most of the sorrows of man, I incline to think, are caused by just such repining. Alone among the animals, he is dowered with the capacity to invent imaginary worlds, and he is always making himself unhappy by trying to move into them. Thus he underrates the world in which he actually lives, and so misses most of the fun that is in it. That world, I am convinced, could be materially improved, but even as it stands, it's good enough to keep any reasonable man entertained for a lifetime. As for me, I roll out of my couch every morning with the most agreeable expectations. And in the morning paper, there's always a massive and exhilarating evidence that the human race, despite its ages-long effort to imitate the seraphim, is still doomed to be irrevocably human. And in my morning mail, I always get soothing proof that there are men left who are even worse asses than I am. It may be urged that such satisfactions are lowly. Nevertheless, the fact remains, they are satisfactions. Would the tinsel world that idealists pant for be better? Would it really be habitable at all? I am ready to doubt it formally. It would be swept at best by chill winds. There would be no warming glow of human folly. No warming glow of human folly. There would be no Lindberghs in it to risk their necks preposterously and charmingly. There would be no Comstocks and Wayne B. Wheelers, no Hoovers and Coolidges. There would be no poets with their pretty bellyaches. Above all, there would be no theologians, and maybe no Americans. To Mencken, there can't be a heaven because he thinks he would not find his fellow man there. And I may never possess it, but I'm inspired by Mencken's intellectual courage, his unflinching honesty, but most importantly, because the reason he scoffs and criticizes people is that he loves them so much. Thanks.